Althea Ramos was beautiful, brilliant, and dangerous. An ambitious Filipina nurse whose gentle smile hid a deadly secret. Marcus Liang, her millionaire husband, thought he'd found love again. But he was only weeks away from a slow, calculated death. When Althea's charm turned into a weapon and greed became her only motive, a fairy tale marriage in Singapore transformed into one of the most shocking true crime stories the country had ever seen. Althea Ramos arrived in Singapore with nothing but a suitcase and a dream. She was 27, soft-spoken, and carried the calm precision of a trained nurse. Years of hardship in the Philippines had hardened her resolve to never return to poverty. She had watched her mother work endless shifts and her father lose himself to debts. In her mind, success was not an option. It was survival. When she landed a job at a private hospital owned by the well-known millionaire Marcus Liang, she saw it as her first step toward that survival. Marcus Liang was a man who seemed to have everything. At 56, he owned a network of medical clinics across Singapore, several properties abroad, and a reputation as a generous benefactor in the medical community. But beneath his wealth lay loneliness. His wife had died of cancer 6 years earlier, and his only daughter had moved to London, barely keeping in touch. His mansion was large and empty, his days filled with board meetings and business calls. The first time he saw Althea was during a hospital inspection. She had been assisting an elderly patient, gentle and efficient, her soft accent catching his attention. To Althea, Marcus represented stability and comfort, the kind she had dreamed of since childhood. He would visit the hospital more often after that encounter, pretending it was for work. But everyone noticed his growing interest in the young nurse. Althea didn't discourage it. She smiled politely, answered his questions about her background, and let him see glimpses of her humble life. Soon, Marcus began sending her small gifts, flowers, chocolates, and books about travel. Althea accepted them graciously, carefully balancing charm with modesty. She understood that patience would yield greater rewards than haste. Within months, their relationship became public. The millionaire and the nurse became a topic of fascination in social circles. Some called it romance. Others whispered that she was chasing his fortune. Althea didn't care. Every weekend, Marcus took her to fine restaurants, introduced her to influential friends, and showered her with luxury. He told everyone she made him feel young again, while she told herself that she deserved this new life after all she had endured. When he proposed at a private dinner in Marina Bay Sands, she accepted with tears in her eyes, tears that were not entirely real. The wedding was grand, attended by politicians, doctors, and business magnates. Althea wore a diamond necklace worth more than her entire family's lifetime savings. Cameras flashed, champagne flowed, and Marcus proudly called her his angel. For him, it was love renewed. For her, it was the culmination of years of silent ambition. The mansion that once felt like a museum now became her domain. She filled it with fragrance, art, and laughter that Marcus mistook for love. In the months that followed, Marcus seemed happier than ever. He took her on vacations to Bali and Paris, bought her a luxury car, and gave her access to his accounts. He even named her the sole beneficiary of his $10 million life insurance policy, insisting that he wanted her to be secure if anything ever happened to him. Althea thanked him softly, but inside, her mind began to calculate. She started observing his habits, what he ate, when he slept, how he took his medication. She noticed how easily he trusted her, how he never questioned the pills she handed him. Every night, as Marcus slept peacefully beside her, Althea would stare at the ceiling and think about what $10 million could mean. Freedom, power, a life where she would never have to serve anyone again. She imagined herself living in another country, starting a business, disappearing from the shadow of the man who adored her. And with each passing day, her affection for Marcus became something hollow, an act rehearsed to perfection. From the outside, they were a perfect couple, the kind nurse and the generous husband. But behind closed doors, Althea's heart was already planning the next move. The fairy tale had begun to darken, and only she knew that beneath the luxury and love, a quiet storm was forming, one that would soon end in tragedy. It began subtly, almost invisibly, like a shadow creeping into the corners of an otherwise bright room. Marcus Liang's health started to falter just a few months after the wedding. At first, it was small things: fatigue, dizziness, a loss of appetite. Althea appeared deeply concerned, taking notes, scheduling appointments, and hovering at his bedside. To everyone else, she was the devoted wife. In truth, she was quietly setting her plan into motion. Her background as a nurse gave her knowledge that few others possessed. She understood the delicate balance of the human body and how small changes could go unnoticed. For weeks, she had researched substances that could mimic natural illness, poisons that wouldn't raise suspicion during routine medical checks. Late at night, while Marcus slept beside her, she would scroll through medical journals and old case studies, reading about toxins used in unsolved poisonings. One substance caught her attention: thallium. It was colorless, tasteless, and slow-acting. In small doses, it could make someone appear sick without obvious cause. Althea studied every detail of how it worked, how it spread, and how long it took to kill. When the time came, she began adding tiny amounts into Marcus's nightly vitamin drink. The effects were almost immediate, but subtle enough to avoid notice. He started waking up exhausted, complaining of numbness in his legs. Then later, persistent headaches. Althea would hold his hand, assure him it was just stress, and insist he rest more. When he couldn't sleep, she gave him herbal teas that masked the bitter taste of the poison. As Marcus's condition worsened, Althea deepened her act. She attended every doctor's appointment, nodding sympathetically as specialists failed to pinpoint the cause. She encouraged him to take leave from work, convincing him that rest was all he needed. Behind the scenes, she began quietly adjusting his financial affairs. With his trust completely hers, she gained access to his business accounts, transferring small amounts into a newly created investment fund under both their names. The transfers were minor enough not to alarm the accountants, but frequent enough to build a hidden reserve she could later claim as her own. The more Marcus weakened, the more sympathy Althea received. Friends commented on her devotion, admiring how tirelessly she cared for her ailing husband. She smiled, accepted their comfort, and continued administering what she called health supplements. In reality, each dose brought Marcus closer to death. But even the most careful plan has moments of uncertainty. There were days when Marcus seemed to recover slightly, regaining a spark of his old energy. He would make plans for a trip, talk about returning to work, and Althea would quietly panic inside. She knew the dosage had to be increased, but not enough to make it obvious. Precision was everything. She reminded herself that patience had carried her this far, and it would carry her to the end. Meanwhile, Dr. Evelyn Chua, Marcus's longtime business partner, noticed the decline with growing concern. She visited the couple often, sensing something unnatural about his rapid deterioration. Marcus's blood tests came back normal, which didn't make sense for the symptoms he displayed. Evelyn voiced her concerns gently, suggesting a second opinion. Althea thanked her with a polite smile, assuring her everything was under control. That night, Althea adjusted the dosage once more, determined to silence any doubts before they grew into suspicion. By the third month, Marcus could barely walk without support. His hair began to thin, his hands trembled, and his once strong voice weakened. Althea remained outwardly calm, whispering reassurances and arranging around-the-clock medical care. The doctors attributed it to an unidentified neurological disorder. She pretended to be devastated by the diagnosis, yet deep down, she felt a dark thrill. The plan was unfolding exactly as she had envisioned. As Marcus drifted between fatigue and confusion, Althea stood by the window of their penthouse one night, watching the city lights shimmer. Every glowing building reflected her ambition. She thought of the life she had left behind, the heat, the noise, the endless struggle, and felt no regret. Marcus had become a means to an end, and that end was almost within reach. Soon she would no longer need to pretend. Soon, the fortune he built would be hers alone, and no one would ever suspect how carefully she had crafted his slow and silent death. The night Marcus Liang died was one of those rare evenings when the city felt calm, suspended in a kind of stillness that made everything seem too quiet to be real. From their penthouse balcony, the skyline of Singapore shimmered under soft light, but inside, the air was heavy. Marcus had returned from yet another medical appointment earlier that afternoon. The doctors had told him the same thing. They couldn't find the cause of his illness. His test results were clean, his blood work stable. It made no sense, but Marcus was too exhausted to question it anymore. Althea had made sure of that. That evening, she prepared his favorite meal, chicken soup with ginger and herbs. It was simple, comforting, and familiar. She moved with practiced ease, her expression calm, her hands steady as she stirred the pot. The final ingredient, invisible and deadly, was slipped in without hesitation. By now, she had done it so many times that her nerves no longer shook. As the smell of dinner filled the apartment, she rehearsed her next steps in her mind. Every call she would make, every tear she would shed, every word she would say to the paramedics, everything had to feel natural. Marcus ate slowly, his movements sluggish. He smiled weakly at her, thanking her for taking care of him, unaware that his gratitude was sealing his fate. Within an hour, he complained of feeling dizzy. He stumbled slightly as he tried to walk toward his study, and Althea followed, pretending to panic. She offered him water, helped him sit, and watched as his breathing grew shallow. His skin turned pale, his eyes unfocused. When he collapsed to the floor, she knelt beside him, pressing her hands to his chest as if performing CPR. She screamed his name, her voice echoing off the marble walls, a performance so convincing that even she almost believed it. By the time the paramedics arrived, Marcus Liang was already gone. Althea met them at the door, trembling, her face wet with tears. She explained that her husband had suddenly clutched his chest and collapsed, that she had tried everything to save him. The paramedics rushed to confirm the obvious: cardiac arrest. There were no visible injuries, no signs of trauma. His medical history suggested heart complications, so the conclusion was simple and immediate: a natural death. The body was transported to the hospital, where the attending physician, a longtime family friend, signed off the report without question. Althea played her part with flawless precision. She called Marcus's daughter in London, her voice breaking as she delivered the news. She informed Dr. Adrian Koh, who arrived within hours, distraught and shocked. Everyone who saw Althea that night saw a grieving widow shattered by sudden loss. No one suspected that beneath her sobs lay cold calculation. The funeral was held 3 days later. The event was lavish, attended by hundreds, politicians, business associates, and media figures who all spoke about Marcus's generosity and achievements. Althea wore a black veil and sat motionless beside his portrait, her face hidden from the cameras that captured her sorrow. She placed a single white rose on his coffin, her hand trembling just enough to look believable. As the coffin was lowered, she allowed herself a single thought: it was over. After the funeral, she moved quickly. She met with Marcus's lawyer to finalize the paperwork, signed documents with quiet efficiency, and spoke to the insurance company about processing the $10 million policy. Her story was perfect. Marcus had been ill for months, and she had done everything she could. The case was closed without hesitation. For a few weeks, life seemed to return to calm. Althea spent her days sorting through Marcus's belongings, arranging for properties to be transferred to her name, and depositing the first inheritance payments into her account. Friends visited often, bringing food and comfort, praising her strength and grace. She accepted their sympathy with soft smiles and gentle nods, all the while feeling the quiet thrill of success. At night, she would pour herself a glass of wine and sit by the same window where she once planned his death, staring out at the city lights. There was no guilt in her eyes, only satisfaction. She had built the perfect illusion, carried it through to the end, and emerged untouched. Marcus Liang's death had been ruled natural. The world saw her as a grieving widow. Only she knew the truth, that the fortune he left behind was not an inheritance of love, but a reward for patience, calculation, and the cold art of deception. 2 months passed after Marcus's funeral, and life seemed to move on smoothly for Althea Ramos. She had mastered the art of appearing calm. Her black dresses gave way to lighter colors, her public demeanor softened, and she began attending charity events in Marcus's name. People admired her strength, calling her an inspiration for how gracefully she carried her grief. The insurance company had nearly completed the processing of her claim, and she was only days away from receiving the $10 million payout. To everyone around her, she was a picture of quiet resilience. But beneath that calm exterior, the first cracks in her perfect plan were beginning to show. Dr. Adrian Koh, Marcus's longtime business partner, couldn't ignore the unease that had followed her since his death. The official report had stated cardiac arrest, but the timeline of his symptoms never sat right with her. Marcus had always been cautious about his health, undergoing routine medical checkups every quarter. Yet, despite months of fatigue and weakness, his test results remained normal. Evelyn found herself replaying their last meetings, remembering how pale he had become, how he occasionally winced in pain even when sitting still. There was something unnatural about it. She decided to quietly review his medical records again. When she did, inconsistencies began to appear. Several prescriptions had been added to his files that she didn't recognize, medications supposedly given under Althea's supervision. The signatures looked legitimate, but the handwriting didn't quite match Marcus's. There were also missing entries in the hospital logs, doses that had been administered but never recorded. It might have been a clerical error, or it might have been something far more deliberate. Evelyn hesitated, unsure if she was letting suspicion cloud her judgment, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus's death was not as simple as it seemed. One afternoon, she contacted Detective Adrian Koh, an investigator she had known through previous business dealings. She didn't accuse anyone directly, but asked if he could quietly review the case without alerting the widow. Detective Koh was known for his patience and methodical nature. He agreed to take a discreet look. His first step was to review the medical examiner's report. What he found was too clean. No toxicology test had been conducted because there was no sign of foul play. He made a note to revisit that decision later. Detective Koh then began tracing Marcus's financial records. Within a week, he discovered small, consistent transfers made to an offshore account, registered under a joint alias. The timing of these transactions aligned perfectly with the months leading up to Marcus's death. It was too deliberate to be coincidence. Still, without proof of murder, the money trail alone was not enough to act. He continued quietly, avoiding contact with Althea to prevent suspicion. At the same time, another piece of the puzzle appeared unexpectedly. Clarice Yui, a friend of Althea from her nursing days in Manila, came across a news article online about the death of Singaporean millionaire Marcus Liang and recognized the face of his young widow. She was shocked. Clarice remembered late-night conversations from years ago, when Althea had spoken bitterly about her struggles, and joked about how marrying a wealthy man could change everything. At the time, it seemed harmless ambition. Now, knowing the outcome, it sounded chilling. Clarice reached out to Singaporean authorities, unsure if her information would help, but it caught Detective Koh's attention immediately. He arranged a quiet meeting with Clarice, who provided him with old chat records, messages where Althea had discussed finding a way to secure her future through marriage, and mentioned that love wasn't necessary, just timing. It wasn't direct evidence of murder, but it painted a picture of intent. Meanwhile, Evelyn's persistence finally led to an official request to review Marcus's medical samples. Although the process was slow, she managed to convince the authorities that re-examining them might reveal something overlooked. Detective Koh submitted a formal petition for exhumation, arguing that Marcus's unexplained symptoms warranted a toxicology test. While all this unfolded quietly, Althea remained blissfully unaware. She was busy finalizing her travel plans to Europe, ready to start her new life once the insurance cleared. She believed the chapter of her old life had closed perfectly, but beneath the calm surface of her world, the investigation was tightening around her, gathering silent momentum. The illusion she had crafted so carefully was beginning to unravel, and she had no idea that every step she took toward her new future was leading her straight back into the past she thought she had buried forever. The call that changed everything came just 3 weeks before the insurance payout was due. A forensic lab in Singapore confirmed the discovery of thallium in Marcus Liang's tissue samples. The poison, colorless and nearly undetectable in routine tests, had slowly built up in his system until his body could no longer sustain itself. The report left no room for doubt. Marcus Liang had been murdered. Detective Adrian Koh received the results late at night, his eyes fixed on the printed sheet as the weight of certainty settled in. He had suspected Althea from the beginning, but now he had proof. He began building the case carefully, knowing that someone as calculating as Althea would not crumble easily. He reviewed her phone records, digital history, and every financial transaction made in the months leading to Marcus's death. What he found only deepened the story of deception. Her internet searches included detailed research on heavy metal poisoning, the symptoms of thallium exposure, and methods of disguising toxic substances in food. There were deleted emails linked to an online supplier of rare chemicals, traced to a medical distributor in Eastern Europe. Even her grocery receipts revealed a pattern: purchases of herbal teas and powdered supplements that could easily conceal a tasteless poison. When Detective Koh finally received a warrant to arrest her, he chose to move quietly. Althea was in her penthouse, reviewing travel documents and browsing listings for villas in Spain. She was days away from leaving the country. The knock on her door startled her, but she greeted the officers calmly, confident that it must be some routine verification regarding the insurance. That calmness shattered when she saw Detective Koh step inside and read her the charges: murder, forgery, and fraud. Her expression froze. For the first time since Marcus's death, her control slipped. The news spread across Singapore like wildfire. The idea that the young, beautiful widow had killed her wealthy husband for money fascinated the public. Reporters camped outside the police station, and every detail of her life was dissected in tabloids. Her story of love and loss transformed overnight into one of greed and manipulation. The glamorous image she had built crumbled under the weight of evidence. During the trial, prosecutors painted Althea as a woman who had plotted every step of her husband's death with precision. They presented her internet searches, financial transfers, and the poison traces as proof of her careful planning. They revealed that she had forged Marcus's signature on several documents, transferring assets into her control while he was still alive. The court listened as Clarice Yui testified about her old friend's ambition, recounting how Althea had once said that wealth could make anyone love her. The courtroom was silent as the words echoed, exposing the cold truth behind her charm. Althea remained composed throughout the proceedings, her face expressionless as witnesses spoke. She denied everything, claiming she was framed, that Marcus had been ill long before she came into his life. But the evidence was too strong. Forensic experts confirmed that the toxin found in Marcus's body matched the one purchased under a medical license that Althea had used illegally. Digital analysts showed how she deleted records and tried to erase traces of her communications with suppliers. Even her travel plans and sudden interest in foreign property hinted at premeditation. When the verdict was read, the courtroom felt heavy. Althea Ramos was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. She stood still as the sentence was announced, her gaze distant, her face unreadable. There was no plea for mercy, no visible remorse. It was as if she had accepted her fate the moment the word guilty was spoken. The $10 million insurance claim she had fought so hard for was permanently frozen, and all assets tied to her name were seized by the court. The penthouse that had once symbolized luxury now stood empty, its silence a haunting reminder of how greed can consume even the most intelligent mind. Marcus Liang's daughter returned from London to attend the final hearing, her eyes cold as she watched the woman who had destroyed her family being led away in handcuffs. In prison, Althea became just another inmate. Her beauty faded, her name forgotten beyond the headlines. The woman who once dreamed of freedom and wealth now spent her days in confinement, counting the hours that stretched endlessly before her. The world moved on, but the story of the nurse who murdered her millionaire husband for money lingered as a chilling reminder of how ambition, when driven by greed, can turn love into something far darker than hate.